is shit. Test, mic test. Test, mic test. Yeah, this is in Genius Mind. Yeah, let's start. Let's go. Sorry about that. Also, do you guys have Genius Mind subscribe to Genius Mind's YouTube channel? Are you guys can subscribe? Okay. See, yeah, just try and see whether we are actually live.
We are live.
We are live? Okay, let's do this. Please come and sit in front, whoever is part of this meetup. Okay. Wait. Do I have all my speakers? Where's Ali?
Looi is not here yet.
Looi is not here yet. Ali's
here.
Ali's here.
Without sound.
Everybody is here. Okay, I'll wait until my speakers are here.
Are you expecting them to show up or?
I am expecting at least one of my speakers.
Give it some more time.
This is correct, right? This is correct. Everyone can connect. Okay.
Yeah, this is wrong. So if you invite people to that one,
Hmm?
the address doesn't.
If
you invite people.
Yes.
Took a while to realize that. Maybe that's why you have the editor open.
Oh, okay, I know why. Yay! Okay. Is everyone here? Supposed to be here. If not, I need to wait. If not,
No, but he's the last presenter, right?
is Ali here? Oh, sorry.
You're here.
I'm here. Okay. Let's do this. Okay, let's do this. Hi, and welcome to Ruby Tuesday number 65, everyone. Hi. I hope you guys have a wonderful dinner. So this meetup is proudly brought to you by Surah Labs. Thank you for sponsoring the food and the venue. Big round of applause for them. And we are the KL Ruby Brigade. Like that thing. Okay, Wi-Fi password, you have it. So if you're not, please connect. We are also on Facebook as KLXRB group. If you ask why is there next, because KLRB was taken by KL Blog, when I created the group. So anyway, KLXRB is our group name, and we are also in RubyBrigade.my. Anyone first timer here? You're not? First timer. No, okay. If you're a first timer, please join the Ruby My meetup group. This is how you discover that we have events. All our events are posted there. So if you don't know already, we actually have a Penang chapter, and also we just started a KK chapter. So you can also monitor their events. They're all on the same meetup channel. So if you happen to drop by KK or drop by Penang, please do remember to check out if there's a meetup, and maybe you can join the meetup there. Last but not least, this is our GitHub channel. GitHub account, which we have the code for the Ruby Brigade website, and we are also on Slack. Please join Slack. The Ruby Relations Slack channel. If you're not joined already, the link is here. You can invite yourself by going to rubybrigade.my /Slack_invite. So most of us are there. So if you need to direct message me anything, hey, my speaker is here. So yeah, this is how you can get in touch. But yeah, I'm Jimmy. So I'm your host. And if you have anything to comment or complain, please let me know. Please introduce yourself. This is a meetup. This is a social event. So please say hello to your next door neighbor. I forgot to bring the stickers So please remember to introduce yourself and make sure your friend knows your name. uh, like I said, no name tags.
How come you always forget everything?
Because I rely on Carlos. Carlos, you have to be here in the meetup. And at the end of this, we have a segment called To the Island. It used to be called Ruby Tips and also called Show Me What You Got, but now it's To the Island. Hopefully, after the name change, the response will be better.
Are you collecting it?
Am I collecting what?
Account?
Huh? Collecting what?
Collecting the TIL on our GitHub.
Oh, not really. Not really. It's just for the people who's here present. So this is a segment where you can just come up stage and you can show whatever tips and tricks you got on your laptop, and you have the floor for 5, 10, up to you, minutes. So this is after the talk. So if you have anything, you can prepare, and then we can do that when it's time. Okay, news. Ruby conference Thailand is happening Thursday. No, Friday. Wait, Thursday? Friday, yeah. So anyone is going there? Here? No, nobody's going. Why? Why? No, go there for Ruby conference. Okay, I think the ticket is on sale still. There's a walk-in ticket as well. So if you just happen to decide.
No, the early birds are definitely.
The early birds are gone. I think they're still.
Sale.
Yeah,
It's still being sold.
they're still being sold. It's on sale. Isn't that how you use the word? No, it's still being sold. Okay, the tickets are still being sold, and you can still buy them now. But yeah, please support Ruby conferences. This is the only one in Southeast Asia right now, since Red Dot is not doing it, and I'm not doing RubyConf Malaysia. But rumor has it Red Dot is coming back. Maybe.
I forgot. Was it the organizer?
Winston posted a Facebook message asking people whether Red Dot should come back. I think definitely should come back.
Is it? Or is it just like doing a poll and then everyone said, no, we like Thailand better?
I don't know. Let's see.
Expensive.
Let's see. Yeah, it's a bit more expensive. But yeah. Okay, so just FYI, I think the entire Rapid Warrior team is going to be there. If anyone else is going there to Thailand this Friday for RubyConf, just look us up.
We have a booth.
We have a booth, yes.
We play games.
Okay, yeah, I'm bringing chess. Okay, without further ado, is there anything else? Hiring shoutouts? Any hiring shoutouts?
I don't mind.
Yeah, let's.
We're live on stream, so
Okay, good then.
sites to show.
So apart from hiring, happy to have RubyConf here. I was told to order extra pizza because there were more people coming, but I think you guys have to eat more. But it seems like there's plenty of food.
Let's see whether this works.
Is it better? Okay, never mind. So anyway, thanks for coming and visit us at Surya Labs. We do have open positions. So if anyone is interested to joining our team, please feel free to hit us up. Shows there's loads of postings around on LinkedIn, BCKL, yeah, pretty much all social media.
Okay.
So we are looking at junior, mid-level, senior, any kind of Ruby developers, really.
Nice. Is there a website or a page?
They will be on our suralabs.com website, and they're also on the is it still called Webcamp
Okay.
Jobs website.
Webcamp Jobs, yes.
And I'm not really sure, as it's Samuel here is normally doing it, but he seems very busy, so I'll do the shout out.
Okay.
But I'm sure you can find it if anyone's interested. If not, yeah, please contact anyone at Surya Labs.
Yep. If any one of you are interested, please go and look for all the Surya Labs people here. Okay, thank you.
Hosted by Surya Labs.
Huh?
Like show the office.
Yeah, you can do a pre-60 if you want. Okay. Any more hiring shoutouts? Well, Rapid River has one, but it's in my talk, so. Okay, let's start with the talk. So we have three talks for you today. The first talk is going to be by Ali. He's going to talk about a look into this card. And the next is by me, talking about Ruby Runtime. And the third one is by Looi. It's talking about paranoid programming. I don't know why he's always paranoid about programming. Okay, without further ado, let's put your hands together for Ali. So,
My mic is old, so I don't need the.
okay. Put this here. Can you click and like this is just put this on your belt and this on your this this like
Oh.
is it okay? And yeah, this one just keep in pocket or you can put it in.
Right.
All right.
Is this working? No.
It's okay.
That's
There we go.
Yay.
All right. So before I start, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Ali Ilman. You can call me Ali. I'm the youngest developer in the office right now, and that's a fact. All right. So today I'll be speaking about this card. So this card is a Ruby gem that adds soft delete feature into your app. So some time ago, I was using Paranoia to add soft delete into a Rails application, and we encountered some issues, and I'll go to that at the end of the talk. And I was looking for alternative, and I read the README for Paranoia, and turns out that there's an alternative, which is this card. So this card, can you see it? So this card, as described here, is soft deletes for active record done right. So it's basically a simple active record mixed into conventions for flagging records as discarded. So ignoring that installation, which is basically basic already. So you gem discard in your gem file and then run bundle. So with Paranoia, you would have destroy, which basically makes the record already soft deleted. But at the same time, there are issues where you also have to add Paranoia to the has many dependent association, because if it's dependent destroyed, then the has many association will also be destroyed completely, not soft deleted. So I'll go into example with this card, how it works. Oh, that's more, sorry.
You have to make it bigger and your webcam can read the your webcam can read it. Okay.
All right. Okay. Rails DB reset. So this app, little app I created, Lotion. It has authors, books, and publishers table. So there is one author, Oliver Guinness, and he has these two books, The Posite and Franchise so Gut. You understood that, yeah? And there's also a publisher, which is Bloomsbury. So the records that will be discardable will be author and book. So let's start with the base branch for discard. So feature soft delete with discard. All right. So with this card, oh my god, that's so small. So when you've installed this card and also added the module into the model that you want to make discardable, which is include discard model, you need to run migration to add the time, the discarded attribute, so that you can keep track of whether of when the record was discarded. Migrate, so the attributes look like this: discarded at date time, also the index. And so to start off with, let's go. So with discards, you have the discard and undiscard methods. So author.last, discard, and there you go. And as you can see here, there are two puts here: hello before discards and after discard. So discard adds 6 callbacks into your model: before discard, before undiscard, around discard, around undiscard, and after discards and after undiscard. So while I was playing around with this, I couldn't get the around callbacks to work for some reason. There may be a bug within the gem. So there's only this 4 callbacks here, which before discard to discard. So you can do whatever you want here. And when you run author.last undiscard, there you go. The author is now undiscarded. And it will show it initially. When it's discarded, then it will appear like that. So when you run discard with a question mark, oh wait, which one? Discarded with a question mark, it will return true because it has been discarded. And when you run, same thing, when it's undiscarded, it will return false. So what happens to the has many associations here, which is books, and it's bigger, okay. All right. So author has many books and dependent destroy. Well, in the real world, that may not be the case, but this is just an example. So with paranoia, what happens is that when you soft delete the belongs to, and it has many dependent destroy, it will also destroy the has many, as I said earlier, and it will be destroyed completely. So you also have to add paranoia to the has many model. With discard, what you can do is just, if you want to access records of the has many that are kept because they are, what was it? Their belongs to is this soft deleted. You can do something like this. Let me show. What's the branch? So publisher, first books. So publisher has books through authors, and this book belongs to Oliver Guinness. And if I discard Oliver Guinness and access the books, it'll still be there, of course, but since I added a kept scope into the book model, which basically joins with the author table and merge with authors that are kept, it will show that the array, the collection is empty. So that's a way that you can use to ensure that a has many record is not visible when it's also a has many of another record. That makes any sense. Another thing I'd like to show is that you can also decide to you can also have paranoia discard on this model as well, and just undiscarded joins. But that might not be really how do you say, it might not be necessary, especially if the book is not important for soft delete. What else? That's basically it, I think. So one of the reasons why I was looking for an alternative to paranoia is when I was adding the soft delete feature with Paranoia on a decently sized app, Smack.io. We encountered issues such as another record which has many users was looking for a user ID, and the collection has a user ID, but when the query was run, it couldn't find the user with that user ID. So you would have to also do some hackery or add Paranoia to that relevant model, and basically it's just it might be complex over time. And disclaimer is that I've not used this card on a production ready app, so it's just a tiny play around app here, Lotion. So with this card, it may seem like you are adding verbosity to your application. It looks sort of like against one of the principles of Rails convention of a configuration. But if your application is humongous, you might want to consider this card, because there may be chances of running into foreign key issues, or you need to add Paranoia to another record, even though you don't need to do that. So I'm not saying that Paranoia is bad, because both Paranoia, Discard, and also Access Paranoid are really helpful gems, and they can be used for, I think it would be best to assess your application and see whether one of them might be more suited in terms of code base size, etc. So that's all. Any questions?
Any questions? Ollie? Nope.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was very clear. Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry.
Well done. Is that your first? Is that your first ever like technical presentation?
Well, I did also do a bunch of this. I presented as well, but
Uh-huh.
yeah, it's my presenting like.
Thank you. Thank you for volunteering a talk here. It was good. It was clear. I guess the it was a very simple gem, and yeah, and then the nice thing is definitely that you don't have to add paranoia everywhere, because you know, like I said. Yeah, but like if.
But with discards, if you have the belongs to which is discardable, you can just do the scope cap thing on the has many association. So with that, let's say you have another record which accesses the same collection through, like for that example, will be author. You can just use the joins author and merge with author capped.
So the information is still there anyway. It's just happening on the parent model, not on the other side. So you still have to.
You still have to do something with the relation.
But you're not making the has many paranoids. Like what?
Yeah, but then again, once you start having so many files, you want to find out what is being affected, right? If you have that feature like this top that says it's paranoid, then you know, oh, this has behavior different from a normal active record thing. I don't know. That's different ways of.
Yeah, I think it's a different approach to soft delete. I guess maybe the author was frustrated when he first soft deletes the parent like node, and then all the relational node gets trashed.
Paranoia would be the scope pollution, because it does go to the default scope. So you have to unscope it.
Yeah, you have to unscope that. Yeah.
And of course, if you have like all these scope bits where you have extra default scopes, and then you have to unscope it. And then
Yes. Yeah.
Default scope is.
I think both of the gems have quirks that you have to work around, but yeah, it's nice to have alternatives. So yep, I think that's that. But let me do this thing. Is this on? Okay. I should actually try and use this thing. Let's see if I can set this up.
Are you doing a keynote remote?
Yeah. Sorry, give me a second. It's fine.
Apparently we have
Probably
6
not.
people watching on the live stream right now.
Does that include you? Okay, I hope you guys can see on the stream. Can I move this? Probably not. Okay, so hi, I'm gonna talk about something about Ruby runtime. And my name is Jimmy. I'm an engineering team lead at Rapid River. I kind of host the Ruby meetup. And we're hiring this more on this. So hopefully what I'll cover today isn't too boring, but I just want to give a very high level overview on how the Ruby runtime works, the Ruby compiler, and some interesting stuff that's been happening these few years about the Ruby compiler. The first part of my talk will be about how Ruby runs the code. If you have read the book called Ruby Under the Microscope, this is kind of a book summary of the first 5 chapters of the book. Yeah. But yeah, if you have not read it, this is a very simple summary of that. Then we'll talk a little bit about the Ruby implementations that's around. And finally, MJIT, which is the interesting part that's been happening recently. So how do you think Ruby runs your code? Ruby runs, Ruby runs the code, our code, by first tokenizing it, parsing it, and compiling it. So when you write a piece of code, it doesn't get converted by the compiler. Like Ruby code doesn't get compiled before it runs. It basically goes through a process every time it loads your code. So this is the process that it goes through. It actually needs to do 3 things before you can actually run your code on the Ruby VM. So first, I'm going to talk about the tokenizer. So a tokenizer is how the Ruby kind of breaks your code into something that you can understand. Not even understand, but categorize. So in a way, it breaks up your syntax, your sentences, into little bits that can be categorized and identified. So obviously, you need to write in the Ruby syntax, otherwise the tokenizer doesn't recognize them. But basically, there are words, symbol, phrases that is being used in Ruby. And you can actually look at all the symbols that the tokenizer knows how to tokenize by actually checking out the file in the Ruby repository. This is, I think, 1200, like 12 K line file, not something you want to deal with. But this is basically how the place where all the symbols, how the Ruby syntax can work, or how do you define the Ruby syntax. Everything is actually defined in this one huge file here. So yeah, if you're interested, you can go and look at parse.y in the Ruby repository. And specifically, there's a function called parser_yylex. If I can actually, parser, let's go wire. So this is how
this is basically the part of the code that goes through each character in your source code and do stuff. So you can see that there are pointers to each character, and it's a loop that basically checks white spaces, what to do if it's a white space, what to do if it's a hash character, what to do if it's an equal sign, what to do if it's a next new space, and so on and so on. So in a way, this defines the Ruby syntax. So if the Ruby community developers introduce a new symbol, this is where it actually gets added in, and also, yeah, this is how the behavior change. Now, so we can actually see this by loading this library called the Ripper. If you load the, so this comes with the Ruby release. You can actually include this in your code, and you call Lex. It will basically give you this, which is the tokenized data of the code just now we saw, which is 10 dot times puts. So basically 10 times put n. This is the tokenized version of that. At the left, you can see that's a line number, and then the first is the line, the second is the character, the column. So basically, it actually tells you what the tokenizer tokenized the first character, for example, in your code, the second line, the third line, and so on and so forth. You can see there on the second position, you can see something called on underscore sp on underscore int period. These are identifiers that Ruby, when it's time to pass your code, knows what this is about. So for example, if it's a ident, it's an identifier. It's an identifier that might point to a function or method or anything. And that's why the third value is the value of the type. So in a way, you can see it as the second variable is the type of the token, and the third one is the value of the token. And yeah, it's basically the first step. It will just basically generalize all your code into something like this. Now, so one thing to note is that the symbol that we saw just now, underscore on underscore ident, is not the actual Ruby token. The word that is being used, if you look at the Ruby source code, it will not be on underscore ident. For example, for identifiers, the symbol in the Ruby parser is actually called T identifier. Just something to note if you're trying to, match up what you see in the Ripper versus what you see in the code. So again, it just gives a sense of what tokens are found in your code, and yeah, it doesn't need to match, but it gives you an idea what that is. So the second step is parser. Now the parser actually takes the token and makes sense of it. In a way, it's trying to organize it in a way that it can be translated into actual instructions. So Ruby uses a parser generator. The Ruby doesn't use its own parser. It's using a parser called Bison, and it's a newer version of a parser, a very popular parser called Yak, which is yet another compiler. But what it does is that it takes the parse_y file, which is an instruction to parse something, and convert it into C code. So think of parse_y as like settings for Ruby. and Bison just takes it and converts it into a parser that it can use during runtime when it loads your code. So yeah, Ruby uses a third-party library or third-party project called Bison to do that. And this is done during the Ruby build time. So that's why most, like when you build or install Ruby for the very first time, this is one of the things that it does. It loads your parse.y and builds the parser out of it. So this is a diagram of what happens. So during build time, again, parse.y gets compiled into parse.c, and this is during runtime. The parser is actually the one that's being compiled during build time. It does the job of both tokenizing and parsing your code. So even though we just now talked about tokenizer and parser, Bison actually does both of this job. And after it does all of this, the result of this is something called the ASTs. So AST stands for abstract syntax tree. It's a tree-node structure that basically tells the runtime what function or how to run your code. In a way, you can imagine that leaf nodes. For example, in this case, let's take example of puts n. So in puts n, you can see that the root of the tree is a command. The left node is a put, and the right node is the value that it needs to output. So this is one leaf of the tree, so to speak. And it's embedded in another node. In this case, it's the do block. The block is from the do to the end. So this is a do block. And the do block also has a couple of nodes inside it. And yeah, in a way that the first node is actually the params node, the second is the statement node. So long story short, it creates this tree structure that the parser will just traverse through. And once it traverses through, it compiles the result, and the result just bubbles up, and then this is how you get your final result back. So this is done in a tree structure. Now you can take a look at also the AST that your code produce by actually passing this dump option in your Ruby code, in your Ruby command. For example, what I'm going to show you is this. So if you have, so this is, so this is 10 times Ruby, blah, blah, blah. So I can do dump, and I will just run this code, and I can see the same thing. So just now, the result is given by the Ripper library, which is kind of like a helper version, but this is the actual value of the AST tree. So you can see the actual identifier and the actual names of the identifiers, the symbol that it's being used. So again, if you want to do like research into how interpreter works, or how the Ruby interpreter goes through your AST, or you want to debug some problem with the interpreter, this is one of the way that you can do it, and it's pretty simple to do. The dump option also gives you some other options as well. This one is actually the dump. I think this one dumps out the tokenizer and the parser. This one dumps out the result of the Bison parser, and this is wait, this dumps out the tokenizer part of the Bison parser. This one dumps out the SC3 part of the Bison tokenizer. So feel free to take a look. This is in the Ruby manual. Just type man Ruby and go to the dump option. You will see this. So after this, what's going on? So when you talk about compiler is just a thing that converts or translates one code over to another. So for example, the compiler of C compiles C code into machine language. The compiler of Java compiles Java code into Java bytecode. So these are the things that will run on a different environment. For example, the Java bytecode will be running on the Java virtual machine. So what does Ruby do in the compiler phase? Actually, in version 1.8, actually up to version 1.8, Ruby directly executes your SC3. It does not interpret it into YAF instruction like what it does right now in Ruby 1.9. So what it means is that once it converts into S3 nodes, the Ruby runtime, which is MRI, Matched Ruby Interpreter, converts the SC3 into actual machine code, the C code. So this is how it's being done up to version 1.8. This looks pretty simple, right? So after AST node, then straight away I want to execute. So why do we need another level, which is this? In Ruby 1.9 and above, yet another Ruby virtual machine is introduced, which is YARV. So when you talk about Ruby runtime, nowadays it's YARV, not MRI. So basically, it compiles the result of your S3 into bytecode, which is actually YARV instruction. And then it's interpreted into C and then to machine code. So the diagram looks like this. You have this one extra section here that converts AST nodes into C code. So why do we actually need this? It looks like an extra step, right? An extra step means extra time, extra build time. So the reason actually, ironically, is speed. The reason why YARV is introduced is to compile the AST node into YARV instruction that runs faster if you keep doing the same thing. For example, if this is a very simple performance comparison between Ruby 1.8, Ruby 1.9, and Ruby 3.2.0. I think this is done, I don't know how many years ago. And you can see that actually in Ruby 1.8, when you run iterations of the same code up to like 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, or even 10,000 times, the runtime is actually faster because there's no YARV interpreter going on there. So you can see here, actually Ruby 1.8.7 runs faster than Ruby 1.9, than Ruby 2.0. If you have to only run your code like once, you know. But as you can see here, once it goes up to, I don't know, what is this, 80,000, you can see that it actually starts to switch. This is Ruby 2.0, by the way. If we are comparing the latest Ruby, this will be more prevalent. But this shows you the pros and cons of the YARV interpreter. Why do we need another layer on top of the machine language compiler? So the reason is actually speed. Your code is sitting on a process for a very, very long time. You don't actually, like for example, your Rails app, you don't spin it once, serve one request, and then spin it down. The process is long running. Therefore, the longer it runs, the more benefit it sees during runtime. So hopefully this is a very this is clear enough maybe for you to have a very high level understanding of how Ruby compiles your code into something that is runnable in the VM. If you want to know more and read more about this, this is a very nice book that you can read. It's called Ruby Under the Microscope. What I've been talking about is the first 4 chapters of the book. The book continues to talk about how Ruby handles every kind of things in the code. For example, how to handle variables, how does it store your object, how does it store the structure of your Ruby into the C structure, and how does it work. So if you have not read this book, I highly recommend you to read this book if you're interested in how the inner workings of Ruby is. So this is all nice and all, but actually there are other Ruby implementations out there. The standard Ruby implementation is obviously C. This is what we are used to when we were talking about Ruby. Usually we meant the standard implementation, which is C Ruby. So there are other ways to run Ruby code. If you switch out the parser and the compiler, you can basically run it anywhere you want, right? Because all it needs is to know how you convert Ruby code into AST3 and then therefore, machine code or bytecode. And that's why we have a lot of other Ruby implementations. So JRuby is a Java VM Ruby implementation. Rubinius is actually built with LLVM at first, but I think they have written their own VM afterwards. Truffle Ruby is actually running on Ground VM with Truffle. Mac Ruby is no more, but it's in it's basically transformed into Ruby motion, and Opal is basically a transpiler to transpile Ruby into JavaScript, and the runtime is the JavaScript engine, which is the browser runtime, or like for example V8. So these are the ways that implementations can be written for Ruby, and people do this for various reasons. Obviously, VMs have different strengths and weaknesses. Ruby's VM is very straightforward, very simple. But take Java VM, for example. Java VM is a very strong VM. It's very robust. It has just-in-time compiler, which Ruby has just started to work on. It is being used by many different enterprise apps, and it's very stable. Rubinius VM, for example, Rubinius is a very interesting project because Rubinius implementation of all the Ruby functions are actually in Ruby code. So in a way, you can think of it as Ruby written or by Ruby, if that makes sense. So actually, Rubinius is a reference project for many of other projects that tries to implement Ruby, because Ruby code is much easier to read than C code. So for example, if you want to look at how C implements a Ruby method, actually it's better or easier to look at Rubinius code because Rubinius has implemented that same thing in Ruby. So these are some of the Ruby implementations. Obviously, JavaScript, runs on browser. So if you run Ruby on browser, this is the only way you can do it. You have to use you have to transpile it. So again, many Ruby implementations. Now, the segue to this is what has been happening to the Ruby runtime. I guess in order to compete with all this implementation, there's a I guess a demand for very big performance revamp for the Ruby runtime. And this is one of the ways that is very impactful in sense of performance in terms of the Ruby VM, which is the mjit. So mjit stands for method JIT. JIT stands for just in time. So this is a new compiler for the Ruby runtime. It addresses a couple of things. I wouldn't say wrong, maybe that's a strong word. Not so YARV has its weaknesses. So the first thing is that YARV is built with something called a stack-oriented architecture. Stack-oriented architecture, you can Google it, but basically what it means is that when it executes the bytecode, it puts it into a stack, which is kind of like how the AST tree is written. So like, for example, the root node is the base of the stack, and then when it goes to the leaf node, it's piled on top of the stack. And as it executes the leaf node and the result is returned to the parent node, it's the same thing. The top of the stack value gets passed to the bottom of the stack, and eventually you reach the root of the stack, and then the result is given back to the main program. So this is a stack-oriented architecture. Another architecture which is faster and better is actually called the registered-oriented architecture. Now, this is based on how CPU registers work. CPU registers are the fastest storage location available in your machine. It's very close to where the actual operation happens. So that's why using CPU registers to manage your runtime data is much faster. The instructions, if you put it there, it runs much faster. Also, it runs on much simpler instructions. So for example, like puts method there, in a stack-oriented architecture VM, it needs to do maybe 3 operations. One to put, then the next, which is the receiver, and then you want to put another layer, which is the value. So it has maybe more than 3 stack just to do one operation. But for example, in CPU registered architecture VMs, those instructions actually can be just one instruction. So it supports a much more complex instruction, and therefore it receives less instruction because you can give it more complex instructions. The last thing is that it actually allows other optimizations, for example, from the GCC compiler, to optimize the code some more before it gets converted into machine code. What I mean is that, for example, in YARV, let's take YARV, for example, when you take AST code, you compile it into C code, and that's it. But if you use registered-based architecture, it allows you to, GCC has a way to optimize those instructions even more, so that when it goes to the actual compilation to the C code, your code is even more optimized than if you just compile it into C code directly. So these are the 4 main things I think YARV has a weakness with. So that's why mjit comes into play. Again, JIT is a just-in-time compilation. It's being championed by this guy named Vladimir Makarov from Red Hat. He has been invited to Ruby Kaigi 2017. Actually, I was there. And he's the one that's championing this project right now. His work in mjit includes writing a whole new parser for Ruby, replacing YARV completely. So remember, YARV uses stack. This uses register-based architecture. The name of it is called RTL, Register Transfer Language Generator. So his plan is to replace YARV with RTL, and also so again, doing this allows him to use GCC optimization. So this is kind of the reason why he wants to do this. Plus all the more powerful way of running, or more optimized way of running code. And plus, he's writing a new JIT for Ruby VM. There are previous attempts to write a JIT for Ruby, but none of it actually got any traction until Makarov presented his mJIT project. So mJIT stands for method JIT. There's another JIT called tracing JIT. Tracing JIT versus method JIT. Long story short, method JIT is better. When you can actually try this later. I can show you later if you have time. But basically, there are two different. These are two different approach to compiling a piece of your code that is run many times, and by analyzing your code behavior, if it detects that this piece of code is being loaded and run multiple times, it will compile that into C code, and next time it gets run, it runs it in the C extension version directly. So there's no more compilation parser step. It goes straight into C code. So that's why this is called just in time. It analyzes the behavior of your app and just compiles parts of your code that is benefits from that. And it's Ruby's own JIT. Ruby has an option to use other VMs. For example, it can use LLVM. It can use other VM's JIT library, but that would not be Ruby's under Ruby's control. So that's also one reason why Ruby has its own JIT, because nobody wrote it for Ruby. Everyone working for Ruby is kind of working for free. And basically, it's a community effort. Nobody in the community does that, then Ruby doesn't have JIT. That being said, Vladimir works for Red Hat, so Red Hat contributes his engineers to open source project like this one. So we are very fortunate to have Vladimir working on JIT for Ruby. And yeah, so basically it meets all these criteria. However, this is really far from completion. In 2017, I think Vladimir says it's gonna take about, I don't know, 3 years more to even get it to actually not crash Ruby. So it's far from complete, because you can understand that it's a complete rewrite of the parser. Everything needs to behave the same way. And one thing good is that Ruby has a very clear spec. If you search for Ruby/spec, that's the spec for Ruby code. If you are writing an implementation of Ruby, your implementation need to pass that spec. And also, do you guys know there's an ISO standard for Ruby implementation? If you search for ISO Ruby implementation, you can actually see an ISO document explaining how you need to implement Ruby code. But anyway, specs.ruby is another version of that, which is more useful actually. So yeah, it's far from being complete, and we are all very impatient, right? We are all immediate gratifiers. So here comes YARV mJIT. So YARV mJIT is done by this guy called Takashi Kokubun. They call him Kokubun usually. That's his GitHub name. So he takes whatever that Vladimir has done on mJIT portion, implements it back into YARV, so that he doesn't need to wait for Makarov to finish the RTL part. So it stays. It's still a stack-based architecture, which is slower, but at least we can start using mJIT, which is a good thing, because that means we can start testing the JIT portion of Ruby. So it's available since 2.6. If you're running Ruby 2.6 and above, you have this bundle. It's not turned on by default, but you can run it by doing -JIT. You can actually run this with your Rails app. If you just pass in the Ruby option -JIT, it will actually run your Rails app with JIT enabled. So yeah, I can just demo this a bit. I don't know whether I can. Do I have time? What time is it now? 8:42. Okay, I'll do it one. So okay. So I'm using Ruby 2.6. Straight. Ruby 2.6. So where is that? Okay, I don't have an example code, but I will use opcaret. So do you guys know what is opcaret? Wait, what? Oh. Do you guys know what is opcaret? Opcaret is Ruby's benchmark. It's created by this guy called Mame. The image is an edamame. It's basically an NES emulator. Do you know what's NES? Nintendo system. So basically, he's written an NES emulator with Ruby. And if you have a source code for any game on NES, you can actually play it on the ops caret. It's not very performant, obviously, but it's a very interesting way to benchmark your Ruby implementation. So I will show you what happens when I run this. Wait, let me. Okay. Wait. Let's look at this. Shit. So you can see that so I passed in dash v to show the Ruby version, and I'm using some shim that needs to happen with Ruby not 2.0, and I'm just run the opcaret binary file, and I'm benchmarking against this game called Landmaster. So it returns me with 40 frames per second kind of a performance. And if I try to run it with JIT, this is what happens. It's 65 frames per second. So it's like almost 60% improvement in terms of speed. But then again, this is very specific to your app because, like I mentioned, JIT compiles the part of your code that's being used very frequently that benefits from that kind of just-in-time compilation. By the way, the default number of times the method is called before it triggers JIT is 5 by default. You can change that. If you look at, actually, is there a JIT? No. JIT option. Wait. I think. What? What? Okay. But there are other JIT options. I can't remember. Ruby JIT options. It has a way for you to, yeah. Okay, so there's several options you can turn on or tweak. JIT wait basically tells Ruby code to wait before it continues with the code execution, because when it triggers the just-in-time, Ruby actually spins off a thread to compile the piece of code that needs to be jitted, and then when the next time the code is run, then only it will be used. But if you pass in JIT wait, then as soon as it's triggered, it will wait for the process to finish, then it will continue the app. JIT will both just shows you more things. Save temp actually saves the compiled C code into a temp folder, which you can later go and read. Max cache, minimum call, this is the one that's default to 5. So if you want your JIT to JIT much sooner, much frequently, you can turn this down from 5 to 4 or 3 and see the result that it has on your app. So it will be nice if your app has a benchmarking test suite maybe, then you can actually run this with JIT and see how it actually affects your app. Okay. Okay, that's the demo. Okay, this, yeah, okay, I actually showed this. Yeah. So last time, just before I run, it got me 60 frames per second, but I was running something in the backend. But yeah, just now we got 65. So in conclusion, Ruby is a very long running project. It's been what, 28 years now, 27, 28 years now. It's a very, very old language. So, and it's not being considered a very high priority language. That's why this is from what Vladimir told an interviewer, that Red Hat, inside Red Hat, Ruby is not a very high priority language compared to, say, Python or JS. One is probably because it's more popular. Like, for example, Python is embedded in all Unix system. JavaScript is kind of the hip thing. And .NET, actually, because Microsoft pay Red Hat a lot of money. So Ruby is not that. Ruby is not part of that. So it really lies on the language, on the community to survive and thrive, actually. So that's why it's funny and very glad for me to know that when asked why he chose Ruby, because he actually spent his time, spare time, go and look at Ruby and actually contributed to Ruby. The first time he contributed is to optimize the hash tables, which increased the performance by about 2-3 times. The second time is actually his introduction to the Ruby community. Next one, big project, is MJIT. So he chose because he thought the code was pretty, the code was nice, and he was talking about C code. So kudos to what's his name? To Koichi. Koichi is a writer of the YARF interpreter. Kudos to him, because of him, the way he write the code so nicely, that Vlad chose Ruby. And he did say that he was pleasantly surprised by the community as well, like how receptive of this idea and his project and himself to the Ruby community. So yeah, again, I think this is what I feel very special about Ruby community, is that we are really nice. For some, really, I don't know, maybe it's maths again, right? Maybe it's maths. But yeah, so it thrives on the community. So the more we use Ruby, the more we give feedback, the more we are interested in the Ruby project, the more it will grow and it will thrive. Okay, so that's the presentation. Just a small plug on Rapid River. I work for Rapid River. We are hiring. We are a development consultancy. We build web apps for our client. We also do DevOps and data engineering. We are remote first. So once you are part of the company, we don't really expect you to come into the company. But if you do, we actually have free lunch for you. We constantly make ways, looking for ways to make remote first more viable for us as developer and also for our client. We help each other in our work, so we have a very collaborative environment. We have investment time, which happens every how many times? Every Friday? No, every 2 weeks, which is like a personal growth time, if you want to put it that way. We value very strong communication skills. So because we talk to remote clients, all our clients are remote. So we do need to, we do value a lot of great communication skills. And we, yeah, try to improve ourselves. That's actually our Ruby conference sticker. So if you are at Ruby Thailand, you can get this sticker from us. So yeah, we are hiring. There's a few open positions: lead Rails developer, data engineer, QA lead, and TPM for web analytics. For more information, you can check out our website at microsoft.co/careers. And thank you. And is there any questions about what I've talked about? About Rapid River, we can talk some other later. Is there anything that you guys have questions about?
Conceptually, there's the architecture for optimizing Ruby and JavaScript the same? Like both of them are interpreted languages.
I don't know. Conceptually, maybe, because like for example, changing from a stack-based architecture to a register-based architecture conceptually does the both languages like good, right? Because it's a better architecture. So, but I think also there are quirks in the language that has limitations on how you optimize, like different structure, or because like how you optimize an object in Ruby versus how you optimize an object implementation in JavaScript is vastly different. So I don't think though in that sense it's comparable.
I guess it's small. Let's say if you take like the same resources that whoever that all the big giants back in JavaScript have, and throw it at Ruby, would be able to get the kind of performance.
Yeah, I think so. I think so because so I think that's the main difference, right? There's not a lot of money being pumped into actually developing Ruby. That's how reality is for Ruby. And I think the Japanese community really understood that and really embraces Ruby because of like this is their baby, and even though companies are actually paying for full-time Ruby developers like Heroku, that's still not enough, right? That's still not enough. So yeah, I think if the same amount of effort has been put into Ruby developing, optimizing every part of Ruby, it will definitely be as fast as anything out there. But the caveat is sometimes there are vast difference in terms of how the VM run things. Erlang, for example, I don't think we can implement something, or I don't know. I don't think I have enough knowledge to make comparison. But for example, Erlang's VM, the scheduler, everything, what makes Erlang fast and very robust. I mean, it ties into how the language itself is being written, because Erlang, it's functional programming, and also the object in that, or I guess the first class citizen, how do you say that? It's processes that are not objects. So the way that the language is written and used has, I think, yeah, you can't compare that lah, because Ruby is it's a general purpose language. So the language itself has its limitation in a way that can be optimized because it has to support all kind of use cases, right? Yeah. So that's what I think. Yes.
You said the engine is not so really ready yet for another couple of years, but what about those others, like Opal and stuff like that? Do they work pretty well, or
They
run Ruby code on Opal, or the Growl, or?
Yeah, I'm not following those projects very closely.
I did a presentation of
It works.
a year, was it a year or 2 years ago?
So what happens usually in those implementation that it always lags behind in terms of feature implementation, right?
Not so much. So the
Yeah.
previous project is very instrumental in the test suite because they wanted to track MRI, right?
Yeah.
And the problem with MRI is they don't have, unlike for example JavaScript, it has like this ISO, like the document that says this is what it does. MRI doesn't have it. So basically,
it's just the test suite.
MRI does is Ruby.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So Rubinius was like very, like we set this protocol where we create a test suite, and whenever this test suite passes, then that is Ruby. And so Opal has like about 95%. It's only certain things that is specific to JavaScript. Like for example, strings in JavaScript are mutable, so you can't have you
have to work around those things. Yeah.
Those particular sections of the test suite won't pass, but they implement it. So basically, what happens is Opal, Truffle, which is running in the ground, they are implementing the test suite as they are written, and they are compatible with them.
Yep. So one thing is that the language itself it needs to be compatible, but also it's a totally different story to make all the libraries compatible with all the different runtimes. So that's a whole different thing that you need to consider. Yeah, so
Especially like C extensions.
yeah, C extensions, you need to convert it into Java code.
Yeah, well, because
Or-
like foreign function interface needs to be different.
Yeah.
Like, it's Merle if it's like JVM.
Yeah.
I don't know what happens for OCall.
Mm.
It runs in the browser.
I don't
how
know.
they can do that.
Yeah. But that being said, that's another reason why people change or use different VMs, right? If you use, say, for example, JRuby, you have access to all the Java libraries. Say, for example, handles concurrency much better than any like Ruby library that handles the concurrency. I think I've seen like during my research though. Like,
You have your legacy LTBC drivers that only has Java.
yeah, you can use that then. So yeah, I think you just need to pick your battles. But yeah, some people will just try a different Ruby implementation just to see how far they can push it. Yeah. So hopefully you'll find different reasons to use different VMs for your Ruby code. Okay. That's the time I have. Thank you very much. Next we have Looi. You need this? Yes. Does it work? No. You don't have HDMI? This is not okay. I don't have this adapter though. Do you have the adapter?
No, I don't have the adapter.
Okay. How do you set this up with Chromecast? Can we set this up with Chromecast? Oops. Okay. So you know how to run Chromecast? You need to install a Chromecast extension.
HDMI doesn't work.
Just put in your pocket or put it somewhere.
That's how you split.
Hello.
Yeah, it's great. You have Chromecast? How do you? Where's Chromecast?
No, I think I don't have it.
You need to install
Yeah.
Chrome. Okay. The extension though, not the device.
Not the device.
Chromecast setup.
This one. Yeah. Chrome has extension for Chrome.
Okay.
Missing the cast button.
Oh, you already have it, I think.
Or is it just?
Just cast. Yeah. Okay.
It's not
Chrome.
extension.
It's Chrome. sorry. It's Chrome. Okay. You should. Oh, are you in the same?
I am in Surya Labs.
All caps. All caps.
All caps.
No, I don't know whether 5G works. So
Oh,
it should work. I don't know.
so all caps Surya Labs.
Same. All caps.
What's the password?
So all caps are up. Yeah. Let's see whether you can. Okay.
Okay, let's
Cast.
cast. Looking for devices.
What? Oh yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
There we go.
Then I remember there's a very weird. Okay.
Okay. Oh, well, that was convenient. I need to change my display, is it? Or is it a...
Sorry. Oh, you need to choose where you display it. Which one thing? What do you want to cast? Go back to that. I think there's a way to cast your sources. Desktop. Then you will cast your window.
Okay.
Can you stop and start again, maybe? Yeah.
When all fails, restart it.
Okay.
Okay.
Entire screen. Yay! Your entire screen. Share. Click. Share. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Okay. Ken.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good evening, guys. My name is Looi. I'm from a small startup called Spirit Solutions. We build software for construction contractors. So today I'm talking about paranoid programming, and why I decided to talk about paranoid programming is this is something that we experience due to our unique circumstances. Your circumstances may differ. We have a very small tech team of 2 people. And since our company is this small, the tech team has to do everything, which includes directly monitoring customer support as well. So the moment there is any error, any problem, we know instantly. The moment the customer has a problem using us, we know instantly, and we deal with it. We try to deal with it as fast as we can. So we also get instant notifications on Slack, which means if we do a bad job, we are the ones who get bombarded with notifications. We are the ones who get bombarded with complaints. So the moment there's a production error, it's a very painful experience, and it becomes something that we get quite paranoid about. When we write code, we look at the code, we'll review it multiple times, and we'll be like, okay, is this guy safe for production? Is this guy going to cause problems? So of course, if we wanted to reduce errors, we could spend a lot more time writing exhaustive tests. But then again, we only have 2 people, and if we spend all our time writing tests, we are not going to get any features out of the door. So we do what we can to push code at a fast enough velocity for us. So that is what that is why what makes me paranoid when it comes to programming. How about you guys? What do you guys usually look at? What do you guys usually keep an eye out for when you're writing code? Wrong method. That one you should be able to catch it through an integration test suite, right? Like you should have CI coverage to catch that, right? So if it can be caught by the CI, I'm not so paranoid about it. Yeah, it's when it cannot be caught by the CI and it causes problems for us later, and then that is when I have an issue with it. So I was thinking about this topic, and then these are the few items that seem to come out very strongly on top when I'm reviewing pull requests, when I'm writing my own code. I realize the main issue that I have is when the code isn't absolutely clear. So if I look at the code, it works. It covers most of it covers all the bases technically, but I look at it first glance. I can't really get what it does. That's a problem for me. That's a big problem for me. Another one which is related is when your flow control is complex. This usually happens when I try to be clever. I try to save a few lines, and I try to meta program to iterate over an array to call methods instead of directly calling the methods. So then later, 3 days later, I look at the code, I'm like, what the hell does this thing do again? So usually if it's complex, then it comes back to bite me in the ass. I also pay a lot of attention to method arguments, whatever gets passed into a method, because that's usually where a lot of pain comes in. The method itself looks fine. It looks like it does. It looks small. It looks focused. It looks like it does whatever it's supposed to do, and then it blows up on a certain input that nobody would have ever foreseen. Another one that I look at and I try to find to deal with it is dependencies. Dependencies are particularly painful because this is where you get silent failures. This is where you get the failures that your CI doesn't catch. You write code which calls another object. That object calls some other method, deeply nested 4 or 5 layers. Somebody does some combination in production, and boom, something blows out, which in the most convenient possible time. Of course, it doesn't. Okay, so let's talk about a bit on what unclear code usually looks like to me. When the naming itself is not very intuitive, I look at the method or I look at the class, I look at the names. They don't quite seem to give a cohesive story of what it does, and that takes so I actually need to follow the flow in detail to figure out what it does. The naming doesn't tell me straight. Then that's an example of unclear code. Sometimes I read it, I don't understand why it's doing it. To understand why it does it, I have to go and read the enclosing class. I have to go and read on what the rest of the code which interacts with it. I need to build a lot of implicit context before I can understand what this method does. And of course, when you have all these cases, all your capacity is just focused on trying to figure out what the code does. You don't have capacity to look for logical issues. You don't have capacity to look for bugs and edge cases. I was digging through some of my code, to find an example. So this would be one example of what I'm talking about. Okay. Yeah. So our business domain deals with construction projects. Construction projects, what happens is that you have a developer who hires a contractor to build the house. So how they pay the developer, how they pay the contractor is that usually on a monthly basis, the contractor will submit a progress claim asserting that I have completed this much work. Then the developer is going to verify whether the work has been done. Is this the right correct percentage? And then if it's correct, they'll issue a certificate. And then once they have the certificate, then they'll make payment. So this happens on a monthly basis. And for a contractor, for a smaller contractor, it can be quite hard to keep track of it. So let's say you have 30 small projects going on. You have maybe 10 to 20 project teams running all over the place. So it's hard to keep track of which claim has been submitted, which claim has not been submitted on time. So that's part of the functionality that we built. So as part of being able to tell whether the claim has been submitted, one thing we did previously was we capture the last progress claim due date. So this is the last claim that should have been submitted. So the contract will have a clause saying this is a submission interval. You submit every month, every quarter, or you only submit it once. Then once you so normally it's monthly, so we just implement it for monthly yet because none of our clients have asked for anything other than monthly. So first clause is to check the unit. Then we need to check whether the progress claim itself has been submitted, whether the last progress claim was submitted before or after the cutoff date. So there's a strict cutoff date in the contract. If you submit it past the 25th of the month, it's considered a claim for next month. It's not considered a claim for this month anymore. So it has legal implications here. So we need to check whether date.current.day is past the cutoff. If it's past, not past the cutoff, then we take the current month. Otherwise, we take the previous month, and then we try to model it. And then we have to check commencement date. When this is an edge case, okay? Did the client just put a new project into a system which has not started yet? Then if the commencement date is a future date, then we don't have a next progress claim date for it yet. So it's not very complex logic, but if you look at the code, it's not clear. This the whole cycle of what needs to happen is not clear, and that's not a big problem in itself if it's just one isolated case. But you look at this contract class, it covers a lot of stuff. So obviously, this is not the only method in the contract class. If you look at a class full of with like 10 to 15 of these methods, pretty soon it's going to be very hard to figure out what exactly does this class do, because you just have so many little unclear details all over the place. Okay, so this is one of this is an example of a code which is unclear. There's no problem with the code. It works fine. It's tested. It does what it's supposed to do. But if a bug happens, it's not easy to go in and figure out what was supposed to happen. Okay, so next one, flow control. This is something that I see quite a bit. You have execution flow which cuts across different methods. So method A calls method B, calls method C. Then you go back, and then you have to when you are trying to figure out what the method does, you have to scan through the same file like 5-6 times if you are lucky. If you're unlucky, you have to open multiple other files to figure out where the hell does my control flow actually go through. And this is a starting point for what is usually called a big ball of mud. You end up with a big ball of spaghetti logic that nobody dares to touch because nobody can follow the execution flow inside there. So what does this look like? So this is permission handling code in the system. We are using can. We wanted to change it from a hard-coded structure to a database-driven structure. So it proved to be a bit more complex than we thought it would be. Okay. So what we do is we hard-code our the default permission structure that is supposed to be there. So this would be the default structure that we see if the client doesn't want to customize their permission structure. We hard-code system restrictions. You are absolutely not allowed to do these things. So, and when then we load the file. So we initialize the user on line 27. Then we go into load role permissions. So load role permissions, it's still quite straightforward. We just load it from the database, and then we call role permissions on each record we load from the database. Now comes the funny part. Now comes the fun part. In role permissions, we have to check: does this user have the permission? I don't know what has permission does in this case, and is this action not restricted? So now to check to figure out what does has permission do, I go in one more layer. So does this guy have the role permission from the database, or does this guy have the default system permission for this particular ability? Okay, so role permission just calls it, fetches it from the database. System permission goes back up all the way to the top to this chunk over here, and then checks it, which is also quite a big chunk of code, and then returns. So that was quite a mouthful. Now we go back to role permissions, and then we start going into the next branch, not restricted. So not restricted is a lot simpler. We convert to alias, and then we just track this block over here straight. So this is the kind of situation that bugs me. Like technically it is sound, technically it works. It has decent unit test coverage. It works for most cases. But if I had to change it, if I wanted to debug or change it, it'll be very painful. And this has very deep execution flows. This is still okay because execution flow is still everything is still contained in one file. Now imagine if you break your functionality into modules and then you hand execution flow off across modules. That's a fun experience. Okay.
How did it get to that point?
Sorry?
No, because I've seen a number of code bases that start off.
Oh, that.
And then it somehow transforms into this. Do you know why?
So for this particular case, this was actually quite interesting. I think the initial requirement was to just given was to just pull the permissions from the database. Okay, so the first iteration was just pull code from database. Then we realized there are actually a few things that we cannot, that are very hard to store in the database. There are a few things that require logic. So now we realize that it shouldn't just be in the database. We also need to hard code certain permissions. So now the same code needs to be extended to cater for that. Then we realize that you have your, instead of just actually no, we realized there were restrictions. We had to hard code two concepts: the concept of a restriction, a default restriction, and the concept of a default permission. So this has already undergone a few rounds of iteration. So whenever there's a new thing, a new concept that pops out, the challenge here is to fit it into whatever has already been designed. So you go through this like 5 or 6 times. At the end of the day, you end up with a pretty big ball, because it's tricky to try to fit in all the different requirements.
But it does cover all the requirements.
Yep. Which is a problem. This is the starting point. It covers all the requirements. Anybody who tries to change it from this point on is going to look at it. Okay, I don't want to touch this shit. I am just going to add on my stuff on top of this. Yep.
So it sort of reminds me of premature optimization. Would it be better if you instead do all those conditions in one same method, load all conditions, then assign them by variables depending on the condition of the role or user?
This is actually, I mean, I think the original idea was to do it in one method.
Because like it goes like 1, 2 or 3 methods. So like if it's purely detecting like the role, action, subject class, you know, those same arguments, maybe just using it in the same method by assigning variables would be much more easier to read and much more unidentifiable to know.
I think that's the part where he said each one look at this, he will just add his code.
Yes.
So it's like, okay, I add another method, I call another method.
Correct. So it's like when you start on it, you have the best of intentions. Yeah. Then you implement a small solution initially. Then as you work on it, you realize that small solution is not enough. Then you start adding branches on, and then it grows.
I think Sandy Max did talk about this.
Mm. Okay, so this is another thing that I'm paranoid about because I have done this myself, and fixing it is a pain in the ass. Once it's already grown to a ball, it can be untangled, but it's not easy. Okay, method arguments. You have a nice little method which looks small and clean. You know what it looks very clear as to what it does, but sometimes whatever comes in is not what you expect. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's non-obvious. So I had this little method called drop down dates. So what it does is that it generates an array of dates to populate a drop down. Simple, right? It just generates an array of date strings, which the HTML then takes and converts into drop down. So what problems do you guys see with this method? Any problems? Okay, the most basic one. What happens if start date is nil? So if start date is nil, yeah. So if you compare nil with a date, it will throw an exception straight. So that would be the first. So you can do this, or you can just do. Return. So I return an empty array if unless the date is present. So now this guy is quite straightforward. I check the date. If the date is before the current date, for every month that this date is before the current date, I will increment that start date by 1 month, and I'll push a date into the result. Okay, so any other problems? Any other potential problems with this method?
Well, start date could be isn't the random number, it can be string, it can be number, it can be
Exactly.
It can be an object, it can be whatever other than the date.
Exactly. Start date might not be a date.
The condition would be like return empty array of the start date, and start date is a date.
I will actually do start date to date. If so, if I can convert it to a date, then I'm okay with it. If I cannot convert it, if I cannot convert it to a date, then I'm not okay with it. Okay. So, okay, I didn't cover that case because I don't call this thing in many places. So I deem it relatively safe to not cover that case. This is how it gets covered. This is how it gets called. I have this functionality in my application called a material list. So in the material list, we allow the user to filter by month. So the user can see what did the material list look like on a certain given month. So we have different list items in the material list. These list items can have materials which were requested and materials which were purchased. Okay, so what we do here is we pull the absolute first date one of these events happened. The material was added to a material list, or the material was purchased, all the material, all the list item itself was created at. So we pull this guy out, and then we push it into this to generate a drop down. So this uses lim. Any potential problems with this code? Okay, this one is not obvious at all. It worked fine for most cases, but for one particular project, the material list was taking like 5 to 8 seconds to render that page. So like all the other projects were fine, just for this one stupid project. So I was like, what's happening here? Why is this particular one so much slower instead? And it has to be an issue with the data. So I followed this. I went down to this. I passed I followed this. I passed this into that project, and I got this value. So apparently, some genius decided to issue a material requisition somewhere around the 14th century. So I had a drop-down generator with like a few thousand months worth of data. Yeah. So after that, start date equals date dot. If start date is older than date dot, current minus 1 year. Yeah. Okay. So that's another thing for me to be paranoid about. I look at the method. I'm like, how the hell? What the hell can somebody pass into this to screw the whole thing up? Okay. The last one which bugs me is dependencies. So what's a dependency? Dependency.
Something that you rely on to do certain things without you having control over it.
You may have control over it. You may have control over it. Yeah. But you may have control over it, but it's still going to cause problems because it happened. It is dependent on something external. So you have all the fun bugs from method arguments, but now it's squared because all these issues can happen outside, not inside the direct the direct aspect of the dependency that you are looking at. When you change the dependency itself, you may break whatever is calling a dependency, which is fine. The problem comes when you change something your dependency is dependent on, and it breaks that dependency. You don't even know. You don't even see it coming. So this one is a bit of a messy one. So we have some code which around creating a purchase order, and when we create a purchase order, we do like a lot of stuff. We'll generate a PO number for them for the purchase order. We will record the creation event. We'll update the status of the request for the purchase order. We'll send a Slack notification. We'll send email notifications according to whether the user has a setting enabled, and yeah, fine. That's it. Then we are done. The thing about this code is that, again, it works. It's tested, but if I look at it, there are a lot of dependencies inside here. The moment, basically, every dot inside this file is a dependency. So I'm depending on my on company.current to have a method called feature enabled. So if that interface ever changes, it's going to mess up this this chunk of code. I'm dependent on the purchase order to have a method called save. It's also a dependency. It's a dependency from active record. It's a bit more reliable than the other dependencies, but it's still a dependency. I'm dependent on my audit class having this exact interface. So in future, if I change this, let's say I change this create for it to take a string, will it break? Is this guy going to break? I don't know. It might or it might not. I'm dependent on my purchase order having linking to a request, and the request itself having something called update status. And then I'm also dependent on notify Slack job, so on and so forth. Okay. I had another interesting bug here to do with dependencies. So one of my this purchase order mailer was failing for some reason. Okay, it was firing. It got sent out, and then it was firing a lot of errors. And then I'm like, why the hell is the email itself failing? Email is a very simple thing. You just pass in for most of our emails. You pass in a user object. You'll just take the email from the user object and you'll just fire it out. It's a stupid class. So what we realized was inside this whole this tangle of this jumble of dependencies, one of the purchase orders material requests. So each MR has an owner, which is essentially a reference to a user. So one of the users was deleted. So you delete the user. You have this method which takes the requester and the approver and it sends emails to them. So suddenly this method has a nil inside where you expect it to be a user, and then that nil gets fed to the email, and boom. This kind of thing it's a bit hard to prevent, but it's critical because you will have areas of which are I call these areas glue code. They glue together a lot of different objects. So you'll have your models. Models deal with things inside. You'll have some of your domain classes. They are very tightly focused. They only do one thing. It's easy to tell what they are doing, but you'll always have this service classes which they just glue a lot of things together, and this is where shit is going to happen. Because the more complexity you put inside a service class, the more dependencies you have, boom, that's where you have trouble. So that's most of it for the. These are the main things that bug me. I want to talk about what are things that I try to do to mitigate them. So when it comes to unclear code, I always try to put myself into a position of if I've never read this code before, okay, if I'm new to this company, I'm new to this code base, this is the first chunk of code that I'm reading. How easy is it for me to understand? How much code do I need to read before I can get a handle on what it's doing? This is usually extra effort to write something that is beginner friendly. It's very easy to give it whatever name. It works. All the tests pass. Push it up into production, and that's it. But to make it beginner friendly takes extra effort. But I feel that the effort really pays out, because for the classes where I put in for the chunks of code where I put in this amount of extra effort, the moment I have an error in production, I can go back to it. I can figure out what went wrong very fast. The areas where, okay, I don't have time, or this is good enough, I'll deal with it later. Some bug happens, I go back into it, and it's like, okay, what the hell is happening here again? Another technique that I try to use for, that I try to look at for naming, whenever you look at a class or module, you try to think about it in isolation. What if I don't know anything about the rest of my application? I only know about this one class. Does this name still make method? Does this method name still make sense for this class? If it still makes sense, that means it's coherent. But if it doesn't make sense, it's like, why the hell does this thing need to do this thing? Then you might want to reconsider whether there's a better name to be found for this method. Another thing that I try to look for is natural lines of abstraction. So you'll see you have a chunk of code. You'll have a method which is growing pretty big. It might be easier to break it out into a different object, into a different class to handle all together. But the tricky part here is you have to find an abstraction which is natural. If you force it, if you just try to put it into, if you just take that chunk of code out, you put it in another class, you give it a different name, you still have the same problem, except now the same problem is spread across two classes. So that's your big ball of mud there, just times two. So this is the original example that I showed for unclear code. This went through a few rounds. We refactored that method. So this method calculates. This method just sets the last progress claim due date, and there's a lot of stuff inside which you don't know what happens. So we refactored it into, how we calculate it a bit. So instead of setting the last one, we set the next one. And how do we set the next one? We don't know. We just toss it to a calculator to figure out. So now I like to think that it's a natural chunk of abstraction. It's a natural self-contained chunk of functionality that doesn't really depend on anything outside. So the contract just passes all the raw values that this calculator needs. This calculator does quite a lot of. This calculator now can do a lot of validation. The calculator will check whether the arguments are there. The calculator can do all the messy procedural calculations. But now I am not worried as to whether I can follow this calculator's functionality, because I look at the class, I know it's a calculator, and what do I need to get from a calculator? I just need to get the next due date from this calculator. I can treat it as a black box now. I don't need to pay so much attention to what is inside. My unit tests cover it. I'm good. So flow control, the same example over there. Only solution is to always be refactoring. So the moment you feel it starting to get a bit out of hand, start trying to clean it up. So refactor. I really like this quote from Kent Beck. If you want to put in something new, first you make the change easy, then you make the easy change. But I mean, it sounds easy, right? Sometimes making the change easy is bloody hard. I had a recent case where I realized some of my active record attributes were on the wrong model. So I had to, for me to put in a new chunk of code easily, this attribute should be on this model. Okay, let's do the work of moving attribute, migrating the data. Then when I put in my new chunk, it's very easy. But to make that change easy was a lot of work. One thing that I noticed is a lot easier to do, especially when you're in a code base which is quite big. You're in a code base which is quite big. You're in a code base which is not your own. You will tend to just focus on whatever you are doing. This is the chunk that you are supposed to that you do. You write all of this new code, then you find a place to slot it in. It doesn't fit naturally. You change the bare minimum for it to fit. Okay, it fit, it works. Okay, I'm not touching it anymore. And that is exactly why we end up with a big ball of mud. So in this kind of situation, you if possible, you want to look at the existing code base. How can we refactor that existing chunk to make sure that your new code is going to fit in easily and naturally? And when you look at the whole thing after you do that, it's still going to look like a coherent whole instead of spaghetti, meatball. So that example that I did earlier, we went through a refactoring exercise. So in this particular case, it got simplified significantly. So instead of going through that level of flow complexity, now all the control flow is in one single class. So I disambiguate it first. This is for can treats edit and update as aliases. So disambiguate, check whether it's system restricted. So system restricted is going to dig into a hash up here. If it's not, then I check whether it's inside the database. If it's not inside the database, then I check whether it's permitted. Go back, another one-line method, go up, and if it's not, then false. So it's the same code as this one, except we put in the effort to refactor the whole thing and make sure that it is a lot simpler. So you go from all this code to this. I think it's a lot easier to understand in this case. One tip for this refactoring, how we achieve this refactoring is by inlining everything first. So we literally took every single method. You have load role permissions. We take this guy out. We move this guy up. Okay, then we get rid of this one. Then we took this one out. We moved it in. Okay, that one is a bit harder to move. So at the end of the day, we ended up with a big method which was like I think 20 lines long. But once we had a 20-line method, it became a lot easier to see how does this 20-line method relate to each other, and how can I restructure this 20-line method. And once we did that, we ended up with much shorter method. So that's something that I feel very strongly about flow control. If you see complex interactions between your classes, that is something that needs to be dealt with as early as possible. The other two arguments, I already talked about it. You want to consider the method in isolation. If I see this guy in isolation, okay, this argument isolation, what values are going to cause trouble? If I put this to a null value, it's going to cause trouble. If I put it to a very late date, or I put it to a very early date, is it going to cause trouble? What kind of trouble is it going to cause? If I don't pass in a date, is it going to cause trouble? And if I have all of these conditions, then which conditions are critical for me to deal with? Some methods, I don't care if you pass in garbage. You get in garbage, you get back harmless garbage. That's fine to me. But if you pass in garbage, which is going to crash the method, then I have to do something about it, because that will stop execution of the whole application. So you can cast it to a sane value. You check for presence. You check for validity of the method. I also like to use null objects in some case. In some case, where you expect an active record method, the active record method comes with a whole lot of attributes. You just create a null object with placeholders for those attributes, and you toss it in. Behaves the same. Okay. Dependencies. This is a tough one. What I look for. Ideally, you want to reduce the number of dependencies. So if you can, if you don't need this dependency, you try to get rid of it. So how do you do that? So let's say I have this guy. I have this guy calling purchase order dot material requisition dot update status. Then, so now the question is, I am reaching from purchase order into material acquisition into update status. That's two dependencies. So what if I move that onto material acquisition? So now I have removed one dependency, but I've changed the dependency onto purchase order. But that is actually a much better thing, because it's easier for me to test this method on purchase order that this thing is present. One pattern that Active Record makes available to us is delegate. Which one is it? Okay, so there are a few different attributes that whenever I'm displaying. So this is my contract class. Okay, so whenever I'm displaying my contract, I want to have access to these few attributes. But if for me to have access to this attribute, I'll be doing contract dot last progress certificate dot certified amount. I'll be doing this a lot inside whatever I'm calling. So instead of doing that, I just delegate it. So now I can call contract dot certified amount straight. I reduce the surface area that I'm exposed to. And if I want to change the association name in future, it's a lot easier, because I still have the method available. So I talked about active record safe being a dependency. So it's a dependency, but it's a stable dependency. Okay, because we know that the active record methods are there. They are not going to be changed in the short term. We can depend on that guy being there. But if it's a dependency that we wrote ourselves, we created a model with that class ourselves, then we have to ask ourselves, how stable is this? Is this something that I'm going to refactor in the near term? or not even in the near term, is this something that I'm going to refactor 6 months or 1 year from now? If it's something that I'm going to refactor, maybe I want to think of another way to avoid touching a dependency which is not so stable. We also want to understand coupling. So every dependency essentially ties your class to the other class, to the dependencies class. So how do you cannot avoid it, but you can take steps to try to reduce the impact of it. So what I talk about here, delegation, that helped me a lot when I wanted to remove move the attribute to a different class, because I just delegate from the old class to the new class. So everything calling it didn't have to change. I just had to ensure that the data and the reference was correct. Coupling is something. The technical term for coupling is something called connaissance. So there's this interesting website that that you guys should take a look at, connaissance.io. So it talks about different types of connaissances. So you have connaissance of name, type, meaning, and how are they actually coupled together. So it also elaborates on how a few other properties of connaissance. How strong is the connaissance? How if you want to connaissance of name is usually not hard to change, because rename is easy to find and rename. But if you have a few of them which are a lot harder to change, for instance. So if you guys should take a look at this one. And as finally, for dependencies, integration test coverage is quite critical. You notice I don't really cover testing inside here. I don't really cover testing here, because to me, unit tests are nice to have. They are critical in some areas. They are not critical in other areas. But integration tests are critical for because they offer the widest amount of coverage. And if you have problems with dependencies, integration tests are the ones that surface it first. But of course, you see a test failure, going in to figure out what failed in the test is a bit painful. Okay, so that's all I have for this talk. This talk is about what makes me paranoid when I see it in my code. So questions?
Any questions for Louis? We have a few minutes before we actually have to go shop. But yeah, any questions? Paranoia.
Yeah, the paranoia jam. Yeah, I looked at this card. The guy who wrote this card is a pretty damn good programmer. He
I must say, the last time I actually attended one of these was 3 years ago. And you were giving the same talk. I remember.
Probably a different aspect of it.
Same topic, but probably different.
Kind of like, I was thinking about Sobe when you were talking through your paranoia, and I think it would help a lot. I don't know whether you have time in your project to actually try it, because it definitely solves a lot of, like, for example, the dependency issue, like the parameter issue that you mentioned.
Sorbet helps a lot with method parameters, but it only helps one dimension of it, and it doesn't help with the complexity. It doesn't help if you choose to put in a lot of dependencies. It just ensures that it runs, but it doesn't help that.
Yeah.
Uh,
So it's like it takes care
mm.
of like edge cases that you don't really want to spend much time thinking about it, and you don't want to like put a lot of guard clauses or integrate test it.
Yep.
So I think it will help in that sense, maybe.
I
I
think
don't know. Like, have you tried like implementing like parts, like new bits of your code with Kobe?
no.
Well.
I don't want to put in another structural dependency. Yeah. It becomes an I need to take care of. Yes.
It's a trade-off with dynamic typing, not just Ruby.
Like statically typed language, I did some Haskell back in uni, and think it's like a totally different way of thinking about code. Because
that's the main, I feel like difference when you switch languages.
Yeah.
Unless you're switching to like a more or less same concept, like not concept, like this what is that word for it?
Paradigm
Kind of language. You will need to use a different mentality when you think about how you write your code, like your app. So yeah, this is the thing that we need to deal with. That's why the stuff is typing.
The best, you sum it up, keep it simple, because I just inherited another project, so same thing, control flow, you look at it, right? It's like, the XPCD comic, you can measure by the amount of what the fuck. You read it, it's like you have no idea what it's thinking. Abstraction, what abstraction. Those 7 levels to find out.
Oh yes.
So just keep it simple.
Anti-meta programming, like distributed,
I used to like try to look for abstractions. Then after I realized if it's worth abstracting, right, a natural abstraction will probably be quite obvious.
Yeah.
If it's obvious, it's probably not the right time to abstract. And if you refactor the code properly, even if you have like you have like 300-400 lines in one single file, it's still relatively understandable. Yeah. So nowadays, to me, it's, do I find this file understandable? If I find this file clear and understandable, then I don't really have issues with method length or the class length. It's perfectly fine.
So I was using project. Yeah. I keep tweaking the length and all this thing. Like I just turn it off. Like I don't really need it.
But that's the thing. Some people they take the solid programming or take it too far. Everything also is an object.
Yes.
Okay to be like, the service object.
Yeah.
Keep it procedural.
Yes.
That's fine. It's really up to you. I don't think you should like be too like what's the word for it?
Picky, religious.
Religious about it. That's a way of putting it. You, like because it changes, especially like when you read a new book or you read a new article. Like, oh, this one. I will this one. I die. Surely you die. This is so I think yeah, follow common sense. You are the maintainer of your project, so
Yes.
If it makes sense for you, then it's fine.
But I find a very big chunk of it is also how much do you care about the project, and how much do the other people working on the same project with you care about it. If you care a lot about your code, but you see the other people are like whatever, then yeah, you're a lot less incentivized to do it properly as well.
I mean, besides the code thing, process-wise, there's a lot of work that can be improvement that can be done there to reduce all of this problem, like good code review. Because like seen people code review that doesn't include the original author as the reviewer, and then they just pass the review saying, "Oh, this is a good refactor." Doesn't even understand what the whole thing does. Good refactor, and then merge the code and breaks everything. Especially with big teams, so I don't
You
understand.
seem to be speaking from experience.
I talk to Karuna, he knows what I'm talking about.
Are we still recording?
So yeah, I mean, I think like having good coding hygiene is definitely way to reduce paranoia.
You always have someone to review, someone will actually challenge you and say stuff, not just rubber stamp the code just so that
When you see like code review with just like legitimate like thumbs up, then
I think another part is how close are the developers from the problems? Because if you have a team where everything is very decentralized, you write code, it gets tracked by somebody who's in charge of QA, and then if it goes out to production, there's an error, it gets caught by some other team. Then it's like you don't feel anything, you don't feel any incentive to ensure that your code is bug free, because you are incentivized on how much you can get done.
I sort of get the feeling that Ruby Rails works well with smaller teams. When you have big teams, it goes haywire.
Yes.
Throw all this out the window. Everybody has their own style, just to maintain the style and the readability and all this. It's very.
I would disagree that this is a Ruby or Rails problem, but yes, this is a organizational problem. Like,
if anything, Rails actually makes it easier for other teams to work together because you have the same.
because Ruby is like Rails is convention, like over configuration.
If you work with a Sinatra code base, everyone just rolls everything.
Exactly. So
routers are
but
GitHub is like using how big is GitHub?
Well, definitely has a big code base as well. Like at least couple of models.
what was that? The Kupat.
Kupat,
It's monolithic.
Yeah, it's monolithic. I mean,
Huge.
I've seen a model with like at least 1,500 lines.
Again, it's fine if it's the purpose is to make it easier to understand.
Yeah. With a big chunk of code, like
Okay, I think we're out of time. Thanks, Looi.
okay.
Okay, yeah. Is it anything you want to talk about? His paranoia? Just go and talk about it. Okay, cool. I don't think we have time for the to the head. So I think it's the end of the meetup. Does anyone has something that they want to really want to show? We can, if you can do it in 1 minute.
Oh, I found one tip as I was researching on this.
What?
So I was like, for the method arguments, I was like, are they called parameters or arguments? I was like, I'm a bit confused. So apparently, when you're defining it, then it's called parameters. But what the actual what you call it with, those are arguments. When you actually run and call it, those are the arguments.
Oh. Is that like a standard thing, or is this a Ruby thing?
in every language, like JavaScript, like when you create a function, the variables that you define are parameters. What you pass in are arguments.
Okay, cool. Nice. Today I learned argument versus parameters.
Yes.
Okay, thanks, Looi. Get together. Okay, if that's it, then that's the end of the meetup. I will meet you either in Bangkok for Ruby conference or meet you guys next week. Next month.
We can
Bye.
also meet next week.
Bye.
Yeah. Just like downstairs.